Hi guys, welcome back. We are going to continue from where we left off last time, which was a discussion of postmodernist tropes within MAUS, and we are going to be specifically looking at some of the other things that are mentioned in the contextual reading from BC Learn. So we are going to today be talking about how MAUS is self-reflexive. If you look at self-reflexive and what the word self-reflexive means, self-reflexivity means that a text is aware of how constructed it is. It is aware that it is not a purely honest, single-minded record of a series of events. It is aware of the fact that sometimes there are edits made to it. It is also aware of itself in terms of the fact that it points out things in the narrative that might be good, bad, or problematic. And the way that we do this is we sort of see the secondary narrative of where Art Spiegelman is talking to either his therapist or to the other characters. We see moments when Art is doing the recording, so he's got the little recorder in his hand. So we're almost seeing the background to the story being told. Now, what does this do and what is the intention behind this? The aim of making a text self-reflexive is that what it's saying to us is that it's highlighting to the readers and saying this is a very difficult topic to talk about. And the only way to deal with this topic is to be as honest and authentic as possible. But in order to be honest, I need to show you that at times I am editing. At times I'm changing. And at times I am not entirely disassociated from the text I'm creating. I have my own struggles, and I want you to be aware of those as the creator of this text. He does this in a couple of ways, one of which is very clear, where we see the little recordings, where we see the debate between himself and Vladek about the portrayal of characters, what is included, what is not included. We see the character of Art Spiegelman talking to Marla, his stepmother, about how he creates Vladek. We see him talking to Francoise, his wife, about how does he feel he's doing the honest and integrity that is required to create a text like Auschwitz. And we often see him talking to his therapist about his own mental well-being. One of the other things that MAUS does is every now and then it will break and do something called breaking the third wall. And what it does in the sense is breaking the fourth wall. And what it does is it breaks the wall between the creator and the reader of the text. And it directly means that sometimes the character of Art Spiegelman literally talks to the readers. So here it says, whew, they're gone. Sometimes I just don't feel like a functioning adult. He's talking to himself, but he's also talking to us. In these moments, we have characters and we have himself as Art Spiegelman, as the artist, in a very self-aware manner, talking to us as the audience, saying, this is how I felt when I was doing this work. This is what I was experiencing going through this, and this is why I did this, or this is why I did that. So being self-reflexive makes us aware of the fact that this text is not pure and clean. There's always a background to it, and he is trying to show us that background. And the side effect of that is that it makes it more honest, which is obviously ironic because the text itself straddles the line of fiction and non-fiction, where there is a lot of things that are included, and almost everything included intentionally is non-fiction. However, there are times where he is editing scenes and he's sewing things together that may not have happened one directly after another, and he's editing the way the dialogue takes place. If you think about it, can you imagine how difficult it would be to try and put every single piece of dialogue into these frames? It would be incredibly difficult, and these would probably be dominated by dialogue rather than by the art themselves. So what we're seeing here is that Spiegelman is saying, I know this is constructed. I know I have constructed this text. And I want you to know that. And I want you to know that because I want you to be aware that although this is a constructed text, there is a great honesty to the storytelling that I am telling. There is a great honesty to the work that I am engaging with. And I'm trying to make you aware of how difficult it is to tell a survivor's story. So one of the other things that is quite common, and this is not uncommon generally in postmodernism, and it is the idea of constructing and discussing the notion of time and how time is blurry and confusing and disconcerting at times. And one of the things that actually becomes a question in a lot of postmodern texts is the notion of what is time? And is time something that is concrete, or is it something that we just use to anchor us in the world? And this is something that we can do in texts, is we can play around with that, we can challenge that, we can have discussions about whether time is necessarily concrete or whether we have to engage with stories repeatedly in different manners. So when we're looking at the way that the postmodernist, modernists in general, and specifically Spiegelman and MAUS, discusses time, we see that time bleeds from one story into another. And one of the things that you should probably note is that the portrayal of the characters shifts. See, here what we have is we're talking about 1944, and we have Art talking to his father, Vladek. And Vladek at this moment is quite old. And we see this just by his portrayal. He's wearing a funny little tweed blazer. He's got a blanket over his knees. He's sitting in a garden chair. And he looks like a typical sort of old man in this moment. And what's interesting to do is go and look through the different portrayals of Vladek as we see him in what we consider to be the present. And he shifts. He is not always the man that is old and slightly decrepit and a little bit grouchy. Sometimes he is young and standing tall, and at one point he's riding a bicycle. He's very active, and you will see that he shifts. And what is happening here is we are made aware of the fact that the way the story is told, Vladek would never have just sat down in one moment and poured out the whole story to his son. And Spiegelman would never have possibly been able to deal with all of that trauma at once anyway. So what we're being made aware of is in this moment, very specifically, before I even get to the middle one, we realize that as Vladek is aging, he's telling different parts of the stories in more or less detail. And it's interesting to note that this kind of links up to the fact that the whole story was only ever told fully in MAUS once he passed away, which obviously gave Spiegelman a free hand to include whatever he wanted. But it also allowed him to put the jumbled pieces of the story that he'd heard over probably many, many, many years into some form of constructive narrative that made more sense to us. And so what we're seeing here is a very honest version of those stories where he's saying, my father didn't tell me everything at once. Instead, what he did is he told it to me in bits and pieces, and I've had to go and act like a seamstress almost and sew those scenes together to create a more coherent narrative. And this is obviously a reflection on how trauma is engaged with a person not being able to tell a story in a specific order or being only willing to tell moments at a time because this is when you can deal with it. But it's also an illustration of how at times, sometimes you're not ready to tell the full story. And particularly for Vladek, sometimes Vladek is aware that he doesn't come across as the best character in this as a survivor. Sometimes he is very aware of the fact that he might not be the good guy in the story, particularly in Auschwitz, although it's very easy to say, oh, these are the bad guys. It wasn't just that. It was also the dynamics amongst the people that were imprisoned in Auschwitz. And he doesn't always portray himself and knowingly as the best of people. So that's the first thing. We are very aware of time changing in the modern version of America. But what we also have is how this is a great example of how we have a little scene that is wedged between them in this moment. And this is a totally different time period to the time that we are surrounded by. So we have this moment where they are trying to stow away and get away from the Nazis in Poland. We have this wedged in between the discussion of father and son in modern America. And what this does is it does a whole lot of things. The first thing it does is it represents how the past is always present. You cannot escape the past, and it is never going to go away. It is always going to be present, and something to note is that it is in between two men, and it is keeping them separate. So even though Art is trying to tell Vladek's story, the trauma that he experienced through World War II is probably always going to keep them apart from one another, because they are never going to be able to have a coherent and normal, I say with inverted commas, father-son relationship, because the father has suffered such great traumas and then lost his wife to suicide much later on because of survivor's guilt. And this is what this image being sliced in between them represents, is the fact that the past is always present and it bleeds into the present. It is not something that we can just pack away and say, this happened, now we must move on. But it always blurs over into the time that is now. The next thing that I want to talk about is ethnography. So ethnography, and I'm going to talk about ethnography in more detail in Learning Outcome 5, but I want to quickly briefly mention this here because it is something that we should note. Now, one of the things that ethnography, what I want to start with is what is a basic definition of it. And ethnography is the scientific description of peoples and cultures with their custom habits and mutual differences. In other words, ethnography is very similar to the idea of recording the study of culture and different cultures and how people differ from one another. And what the intention behind ethnography is to be able to record how specific groups interact amongst themselves and how they interact with different peoples. Now, the idea behind ethnography here is, and the original scientific purpose behind it was to record the differences that people have between one another, but not in necessarily a negative manner, but more just for the sake of prosperity, to say, okay, this is this culture, this is how they behave, this is their customs, this is how they have a hierarchy amongst their community, whether they're patriarchal or matriarchal, and have a conversation about how this culture and this group of people are different from because of where they live, the language they speak, and so on. Now, the idea behind this is obviously very scientific in its purposes, but it's also intended to preserve and sort of respect the cultures that have existed before now. And what you can argue that is being done is that MAUS is a study in ethnography, both of the Jewish community, but of what was happening right at this period of time in Europe, and what is happening in modern America with the survivors. So what we see is the way that he engages with ethnography. And if you look at it, each character is, if they're from a different culture, they are portrayed as a different animal. And it's quite a discussion to have about why he chose the animals he did. So we have a very traditional idea that a very easy to understand, where we have the cats as the Nazis and the Germans, and we have the mice as the Jews. So we have the predator and prey relationship. But we then also have characters like the Poles who are drawn as pigs, and I will show you an image of that just now. But we also have a very cute little moment here where we have a frog who, I mean, you can immediately assume, just not only from the language that he's speaking, Dieu merci, which is thank God. And you have this character who is obviously a little Frenchman, and the reason why we have that is that, you know, a frog, it's the nickname that they are called, and that's what was so easy for us to, or for Spiegelman to tie in. It was something that was familiar. And then what we have here is we have a dog who is portrayed as the British or the Americans. I think he was the Brits, if I'm remembering correctly in this moment. And what we have is different characters are portrayed from their different ethnographies and ethnicities as different animals. Now, why would he do that? What is the point of doing that? The first thing that it does is it obviously creates divisions. And immediately on site, we can identify characters as being part of a specific culture. Now, if you think about MAUS as a text, the entire piece of MAUS is discussing how different cultures have failed to interact with each other respectfully, and the result was genocide. What it also does is it shows us that you can strip away those differences and you can associate with all of them and rather celebrate the differences that they have, rather than look at them as problems and try and group them together. And one of the things that MAUS is trying to do is, by making them animals, he's taking away the characteristics that we would normally associate with a racial group in terms of their physical structures and in terms of the way that they are portrayed in media. And he's saying, let's strip all of that away, and if we made them animals, would you as the reader react any differently? Just because a character is portrayed as an animal, does that make you have a problem with them? Does that make you, and in a sense, he turns it into something that's almost absurd and goes, just because this character is a cat, does that mean you have to dislike them? And that's in essence what he is asking. And by stripping away the humanity of the characters, he's actually making them easier for us to connect with, and saying that, does it really matter what culture that an individual comes from? We should like them regardless, and we should treat them fairly regardless, because at the end of the day, they are likable, they are good people, or whatever the reason is. So when we are looking at this, we're talking about how this is a study in ethnography, and we're going to go through this in more depth. But not only is it a study in ethnography, it's also a discussion about how a piece of text might be a discussion on how we are compulsive in classifying things and grouping things together and trying to put them into categories because it is easy, because it works effectively for us, rather than how we can discuss the similarities between people. Now, what I'd like to do is, having had that conversation of how characters are portrayed, I want to talk about how the characters here are portrayed with masks on, and what is the intention of the masks that are used in MAUS. So I've got two separate images here. So the question 1 applies to the picture 1, question 2 applies to question 2, and then question 3 is a comparison between the two of them. The answers are with your lecturers, but I'm going to talk you through the questions first. So the first image is an extract in which you have a Polish character. They're obviously in a train, or they're about to get on a train. And you have a Polish character here who's portrayed as a pig, and he's being spoken to someone who we know here is actually a German. So underneath the mask, we will know that that is a cat, and he's got the face of a pig, and he's using it to try and act as a spy to get the Polish person to admit how problematic the Germans were. And in other words, what would just happen is that he would probably get imprisoned for it, or he'd held up as treasonous, or for whatever reason, there would be consequences for this character if he enacted on what this the spy is suggesting. So that's the first thing we have here, is that there's a very specific intention of hiding one ethnicity behind the mask of another to get some sort of reaction from one of the characters. The second image here, what we have is we have Archbishop here himself as a little mouse, and we have Archbishop's therapist here as a man wearing a mouse mask. Now, I want you to think about what that implies, and what is their intention behind having somebody wearing a mask versus somebody who is embodying that identity. So what we know is that at the moment somebody's wearing is a mouse, it means that they are Jewish, correct? Because that's how the characters are portrayed. However, what we could also look at and think about in a little bit more depth is not only is he Jewish, but he might be the character of MAUS. He might be interacting with the character in MAUS of Archbishop as a possible survivor, or just as somebody from the same ethnicity who has similar experiences of this, but may not have undergone the actual Holocaust himself. Now, that's up to you guys to discuss, but what I want you to look at is the usage of masks is very important here, because masks hide identities. And I want you to compare the different intentions behind why Archbishop would have used a mask in both instances, and whether the one is intended with malice or whether one is hiding another layer of narrative to it. So this is a good activity for you to do, to have a discussion about how the symbolism is shifting through the narrative, how they change and differ, but how important it is to take a look at where the lines between how a symbol is intended and how it can be used, and how that is not always consistent throughout a narrative. So, having a conversation about dehumanization. One of the big things that happened during World War II was the act of dehumanizing people. Now, this is a good example, because what we have is we have the character of one of the guards of Auschwitz physically beating one of the characters. And this guard is portrayed as a cat, but he's not portrayed as just any cat. He's portrayed as an incredibly vicious looking animal. And we have the characters dehumanized here. And one of the things that we need to consider is, by dehumanizing them, are we stripping them down to a more effective and more structured set of identities, where we can think about them not necessarily as a German, but somebody who is enjoying brutalizing someone and enjoys abusing another individual? Or by stripping them and dehumanizing them, does it make us realize how inhuman the behavior of some of the characters during this narrative was? One of the other reasons behind the dehumanization would have been the fact that during the World War II, the Nazis spent a great deal of time dehumanizing Jewish people in the eyes of the people around them in various countries like France, in Germany, and in Poland and Hungary. And one of the things that was done most effectively was that the Nazis managed to persuade huge amounts of populace in these countries to turn over Jewish people because they were less than. And it wasn't just the use of threats, it was the active idea of these people are less than you, and therefore they should be punished for that. And this act of dehumanization is a reflection of what the Nazis had done, but it also has an added layer of meaning, as in what we need to assess for ourselves as readers, how we react to characters and their behaviors just because they are animals in this narrative or portrayed as animals in this narrative. So anthropomorphism, which is part of the same set of ideas, anthropomorphism is the idea of giving a character, or stripping, rather, let me rephrase that. It's the idea of giving an animal human characteristics. And in this sense, we actually have sort of an opposite, where what we've done is we've taken a human and we've turned them into an animal. So we've stripped the human of their human physical characteristics, and we've given them an animal persona, but their behaviors and their dialogues have maintained the same thing. And what we have here is a really beautiful example of that. We have these characters, they're portrayed exactly the same, their movements are the same, they're wearing the same thing, and yet we have the one as a mouse and the other one is a cat. So here we have the complexities of identity here, where this character himself is obviously Jewish, but he also identifies as German. And the idea here is the difficulty of identifying what separates you from one community to another, what makes you one and what makes you the other, and who gives an individual the right to classify you as one and not the other if you find both of these characteristics or both of these labels to fall into your identity. So what the idea here is that what Spiegelman is trying to do is making us realize that we can connect with an individual on a page because we like them, regardless of whether they are a cat, a mouse, a dog, a fish, or a frog. And it doesn't really matter what their ethnicity or their racial identity is. And in a sense, that's one of the greater meanings of what Spiegelman is trying to say, is he's trying to indicate to us how almost absurd this need to cleanse society of an entire population was, when at the end of the day, people should learn to coexist with one another, because if one strips away the identity tags that creates them, they have very similar characteristics to you or the person sitting next to you. And then finally, we have what is a characteristic that is very common in postmodernism, and you're going to see this in a lot of the texts you're doing, which is called humanoid, or in other words, dark human. And one of the things that you find is that because Art Spiegelman is dealing with something that is incredibly intense and very difficult to engage with, is he needs to break it up with sort of moments of humor. And he does this by sort of making the humor quite dark. It's not sort of slapstick. It's not meant to make you laugh, ha-ha, out loud. What he is doing is he's trying to make you chuckle because you go, I can relate to that. So what we have here is we have a conversation between Art and his wife Francoise, and they're driving back from the Catskills where his father is staying, and he's saying, "Sigh, I feel so inadequate trying to reconstruct a reality that was worse than my darkest dreams, and trying to do it as a comic strip. I guess I bit off more than I can chew. Maybe I ought to forget the whole thing. There's so much I'll never be able to understand or visualize. I mean, reality is is too complex for comics. So much has to be left out or distorted." Now, remember the self-reflexiveness that we talked about? That's definitely here. And Francois is saying here, just keep at it, honey. Just keep it honest, honey. And here, this is where the humor comes in, and it says, "See what I mean? In real life, you'd never have let me talk this long without interrupting. Let me light me a cigarette." And this is one of those moments where you have a little bit of humor coming in, because you have the character of Francoise being slightly manipulated by Art to show how a relationship between a husband and wife is portrayed, but also how he is having to edit and sew scenes together to coherently make his ideas come across on the page more vividly. But he's also doing a slight nudge, because anybody who has seen parents fighting or even been in a relationship can kind of relate to this moment when you're pouring out your emotions, and a lot of the time the other person definitely wants to have their say in as well. So if we're taking a look at the next section, I'd like you to make sure that you read MAUS as you reading Art Spiegelman's MAUS as Postmodern Ethnography by Hathaway. It's the longest reading for this section in your reader, and it's just after the Golder reading. It is quite long, and a lot of the stuff we have sort of briefly touched on. We will just be going through ethnography and anthropomorphism in more detail in the next video. Okay, thanks guys, and good luck.